This is the story of the Oakdale Hammer murders, a tale of passion, betrayal, and uncontrollable rage that would leave 2 people dead and a community forever scarred. Derek Johnson was a man who seemed to have it all. At 45 years old, he had climbed the corporate ladder with a determination that bordered on obsession, eventually securing a position as a senior executive at a prestigious tech firm in Silicon Valley. His success was evident in the trappings of his life: the spacious home in Oakdale, the luxury car in the garage, the tailored suits that hung in his closet. Derek's marriage to Vanessa had been a whirlwind romance. They had met at a charity gala 5 years ago. Derek's controlling nature clashed with Vanessa's independent spirit, leading to arguments that became increasingly frequent and heated. Still, Derek clung to the image of the perfect life he had built. He refused to acknowledge the growing distance between him and Vanessa, instead throwing himself even deeper into his work. On the night of the murders, he was returning from a 3-day business trip, his mind already racing with plans for his next big project. Little did he know that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. Vanessa Johnson, née Taylor, was a woman who defied easy categorization. At 38 years old, she possessed a beauty that turned heads and a sharp intellect that commanded respect in equal measure. Growing up in Oakland, she had navigated the challenges of a tough neighborhood with grace and determination, eventually earning a scholarship to UC Berkeley, where she studied psychology. When she met Derek at the charity gala, Vanessa had been immediately drawn to his confidence and ambition. Here was a man who had overcome similar obstacles to achieve great success, a living example of what was possible with hard work and determination. Their whirlwind romance had swept her off her feet, and she had embraced the role of corporate wife with enthusiasm. But as the years passed, Vanessa found herself increasingly stifled by the constraints of her new life. The endless round of social events and corporate functions began to feel hollow, a far cry from the meaningful work she had once done. She missed the sense of purpose that had driven her in her previous career, and she began to question the choices that had led her to this point. It was in this state of growing discontent that Vanessa found herself drawn to her stepson, Xavier. 15 years her junior, Xavier represented everything that was missing from her life with Derek: spontaneity, passion, and a zest for life that was infectious. Their affair had begun innocently enough, with late-night conversations and shared confidences. But it had quickly spiraled into something more: a physical and emotional connection that filled the void in Vanessa's heart. On the night of the murders, Vanessa knew that what she was doing was wrong. She knew the potential consequences of her actions. But in the heat of the moment, caught up in the passion of her illicit liaison, she pushed those thoughts aside, never imagining the tragedy that was about to unfold. At 23 years old, Xavier Johnson was a young man caught between 2 worlds. The product of Derek's first marriage, he had grown up in the shadow of his father's success, constantly striving to live up to the impossibly high standards set for him. It was at Stanford that Xavier began to rebel against the path that had been laid out for him. Instead of following in his father's footsteps and pursuing a business degree, he chose to major in environmental science, driven by a passion for conservation that he had discovered during a gap year spent volunteering in Costa Rica. This decision had not sat well with Derek, who saw it as a waste of Xavier's potential. The arguments between father and son had grown more frequent and more heated, with Xavier accusing Derek of being short-sighted and materialistic, while Derek dismissed his son's chosen field as impractical and idealistic. In the midst of this conflict, Vanessa had entered Xavier's life. Initially, he had been wary of his new stepmother, seeing her as just another symbol of his father's perfect life. But as he got to know her, Xavier found in Vanessa a kindred spirit. She listened to him without judgment, encouraged his passions, and provided the emotional support that he had always craved. Their relationship had evolved slowly, almost imperceptibly. What started as friendly conversations turned into deep, intimate discussions about their hopes, fears, and dreams. Xavier found himself confiding in Vanessa things he had never told anyone else, and she in turn shared her own doubts and frustrations. On the night that Derek returned home unexpectedly, Xavier was lost in the intoxicating presence of Vanessa, all thoughts of consequences pushed aside by the urgency of their passion. He never imagined that this moment of reckless abandon would lead to such a violent and tragic end. The day of the murders began like any other in the Johnson household. Derek rose early, his mind already racing with the day's agenda as he prepared for his business trip. Vanessa, still in bed, feigned sleep to avoid the awkward small talk that had become the norm in their increasingly strained relationship. As Derek bustled about the house, gathering his things and firing off emails on his phone, Vanessa lay still, her thoughts drifting to Xavier. She knew he was planning to stop by later, ostensibly to pick up some books he had left behind during his last visit. The prospect of seeing him sent a thrill through her, mixed with a twinge of guilt that she quickly suppressed. When Derek finally left, calling out a perfunctory goodbye, Vanessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The house suddenly felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. She rose, padding barefoot to the kitchen to make coffee, her mind already planning the day ahead. Meanwhile, across town, Xavier was just waking up in his small apartment. He stretched, his lean body still sore from yesterday's workout at the gym. As he reached for his phone, he saw a text from Vanessa. "Dee's gone. Come over when you can." His heart raced at the message, equal parts excitement and trepidation. He knew what they were doing was wrong, knew the pain it would cause if discovered, but the pull was too strong to resist. He texted back a quick, "On my way," before heading to the shower. As the morning wore on, Vanessa busied herself around the house, straightening up and trying to calm her nerves. She told herself that this would be the last time, that after today she would end things with Xavier and try to salvage her marriage. But even as she made these silent promises, she knew they were lies. When the doorbell rang, Vanessa's heart leapt. She smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and went to answer it. Xavier stood on the porch, looking boyishly handsome in jeans and a t-shirt, a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, eyes darting past her to check if they were alone. "Hey yourself," Vanessa replied, stepping back to let him in. As soon as the door closed behind him, they were in each other's arms, all pretense forgotten in the heat of their forbidden passion. Derek Johnson prided himself on his ability to anticipate problems and stay ahead of the curve. It was a skill that had served him well in business, allowing him to outmaneuver competitors and close deals that others thought impossible. But on this day, as he sat in the first-class lounge of San Francisco International Airport, he found himself blindsided by an unexpected turn of events. His phone buzzed with an incoming email. Frowning, he opened it, only to find that the crucial meeting he had flown out for had been postponed. The client, citing a family emergency, had pushed it back by 2 weeks. Derek's first reaction was anger. Didn't they know how valuable his time was? But as the initial frustration faded, a new thought began to take shape. He had been so busy lately, so focused on work, that he had barely spent any time with Vanessa. Maybe this was an opportunity to surprise her, to rekindle the spark that had been missing from their marriage. He could picture it now, coming home early, whisking her off for a romantic dinner, maybe even a weekend getaway. The cab pulled up in front of the house, and Derek paid the driver, adding a generous tip in his good mood. He noticed a bike propped against the garage, probably belonging to one of the neighborhood kids, he thought absently. Grabbing his suitcase, he made his way up the front walk, already imagining Vanessa's surprised and delighted reaction. But as he reached for his keys, Derek paused. There was a sound coming from inside the house, muffled but unmistakable. A woman's voice crying out in what sounded like pleasure? Confusion gave way to suspicion, and suspicion quickly morphed into a cold, creeping dread. With shaking hands, Derek unlocked the door as quietly as he could. The sounds grew louder as he entered, coming from upstairs. His heart pounding in his ears, he made his way up the steps, each creak of the floorboards sounding to him like a gunshot. The bedroom door was ajar. Derek pushed it open, and in that moment, his world shattered. There, on the bed he shared with his wife, were Vanessa and Xavier, locked in a passionate embrace. They were so lost in each other that they didn't even notice him at first. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Derek stood frozen, unable to process the scene before him. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, rage flooded through him. A roar of fury tore from his throat, startling the lovers on the bed. Vanessa screamed, scrambling to cover herself, while Xavier leapt up, his face a mask of shock and fear. "Derek!" Vanessa cried, her voice shrill with panic. "It's not, we can explain." But Derek was beyond explanations. In that moment, all he could see was red. The red of betrayal and of humiliation, of a lifetime of control slipping away. His eyes darted wildly around the room, landing on a hammer he had left on the dresser from hanging a picture the week before. Without conscious thought, he lunged for it, his fingers closing around the smooth wooden handle. As he turned back towards the bed, hammer raised, he was no longer Derek Johnson, successful executive and pillar of the community. He was a primal force of nature, all reason swept away by a tidal wave of rage and pain. The next few minutes would be a blur in Derek's memory, a chaos of screams, the sickening thud of metal on flesh, and a spray of warm, sticky liquid. When clarity finally returned, he found himself standing over the bloodied, motionless bodies of his wife and stepson, the hammer slipping from his gore-covered hands to land with a dull thud on the carpet. As the full weight of what he had done crashed over him, Derek sank to his knees, a wail of anguish rising from deep within him. In the distance, he could hear the wail of sirens growing closer. Someone must have heard the commotion and called the police. But in that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his life, Derek couldn't bring himself to care. The perfect life he had worked so hard to build lay in ruins around him, destroyed in a few moments of uncontrollable fury. As the flashing lights of police cars began to illuminate the room, Derek Johnson closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable. The news of the Johnson murders spread through Oakdale like wildfire, leaving a trail of shock and disbelief in its wake. Within hours of Derek's arrest, the quiet suburban street where the Johnsons lived was transformed into a circus of flashing police lights, crime scene tape, and news vans jockeying for the best camera angles. As the day wore on, more details began to emerge. The 911 call, made by a teenager who had been walking his dog past the Johnson house, was released to the media. The boy's panicked voice, describing the horrible screams he had heard, sent chills down the spines of all who listened. Local news stations ran non-stop coverage of the case, featuring interviews with shocked community members and speculative analyses from crime experts. The story quickly gained national attention, with major networks picking it up and framing it as a tragic example of the dark underbelly of suburban life. "He was always so kind, so full of life," said Miss Rodriguez, Xavier's former English teacher, her eyes brimming with tears. "To think of him dying like that, it's just incomprehensible." As night fell on Oakdale, a candlelight vigil was hastily organized in the town square. Hundreds of residents turned out, holding flickering candles as they listened to speeches from community leaders and shared memories of Vanessa and Xavier. The air was thick with grief and a collective sense of loss, not just for the victims, but for the sense of safety and normalcy that had been shattered. Meanwhile, at the Oakdale Police Department, Derek Johnson sat in an interrogation room, his once immaculate suit stained with blood, his eyes vacant. As detectives attempted to question him, he remained largely unresponsive, muttering occasionally about betrayal and the destruction of everything he had worked for. The lead detective on the case, Sergeant James Harper, a veteran of the force with over 2 decades of experience, found himself deeply troubled by the brutality of the crime. "In all my years on the job, I've never seen anything quite like this," he confided to a colleague. "The level of rage, the savagery of the attack, it's going to haunt me for a long time." As the investigation progressed, more unsettling details came to light. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed that the victims had suffered multiple blows, indicating a prolonged and frenzied attack. The murder weapon, a common claw hammer, was found to have Derek's fingerprints all over it, along with the victim's blood and tissue. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of Derek's suitcase in the foyer, still packed from his aborted business trip. It painted a clear picture of a man who had come home unexpectedly, only to have his world turned upside down. In the days that followed, as the initial shock began to wear off, The community of Oakdale was left to grapple with the aftermath of the tragedy. Parents held their children closer, couples eyed each other with newfound suspicion, and a general sense of unease settled over the once peaceful suburb. The Johnson house, now a grim reminder of the violence that had occurred within its walls, stood empty and silent. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze, and curious onlookers drove by slowly, craning their necks for a glimpse of the scene of the crime. For the residents of Oakdale, life would eventually return to a semblance of normalcy. But the memory of the day when violence erupted in their midst would linger, a stark reminder that even in the most seemingly perfect places, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface. In the days following the murders, the Oakdale Police Department, led by Sergeant James Harper, launched a full-scale investigation into the tragic events at the Johnson household. Despite the seemingly straightforward nature of the crime, Derek had been caught quite literally red-handed. Protocol demanded a thorough examination of all evidence and possible motives. The crime scene unit meticulously combed through the Johnson home, documenting every blood spatter, collecting fibers, and photographing the grisly scene. The bedroom, where the murders had taken place, told a story of uncontrolled violence. The once pristine white sheets were now stained a deep crimson, and the walls bore the marks of errant blows from the hammer. "It's like he just snapped," muttered one of the forensic technicians as he carefully bagged a shard of skull fragment found embedded in the drywall. As the physical evidence was gathered, detectives began the process of interviewing friends, family members, and colleagues of the victims and the perpetrator. A picture began to emerge of a family that, despite its outward appearance of success and happiness, had been fraught with tension and hidden resentments. Derek's coworkers painted a picture of a man driven to the point of obsession by his work. Many spoke of his long hours, his demanding nature, and his seeming inability to leave the office behind even when at home. "He was always on edge," said Thomas Chen, a fellow executive at Derek's firm, "like he was just waiting for something to go wrong. I never would have guessed it would end like this, but looking back, there were signs that all wasn't well." Interviews with Vanessa's friends revealed a woman who had grown increasingly unhappy in her marriage. Several mentioned that she had been considering leaving Derek, though none had known about her affair with Xavier. "She felt trapped," explained Vanessa's best friend, Olivia Reeves, wiping away tears during her interview. "She loved the lifestyle, sure, but she missed her old work, her independence. She told me once that she felt like she was slowly disappearing, becoming nothing more than an accessory to Derek's success." Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimonies came from Xavier's friends and classmates at Stanford. They spoke of a young man torn between his passion for environmental causes and the weight of his father's expectations. Many mentioned the growing tension between father and son, with arguments becoming more frequent and heated in recent months. "Xavier was really struggling with his dad's disappointment," said his roommate, Ryan Foster. "He wanted to make a difference in the world, but Derek couldn't see past the dollar signs. It was tearing Xavier apart." As the investigation progressed, attention turned to the timeline of events on the day of the murders. Security footage from San Francisco International Airport confirmed Derek's unexpected return, showing him leaving the terminal and getting into a taxi. The cab driver who had taken Derek home that day was located and interviewed, providing crucial information about the perpetrator's state of mind in the moments leading up to the crime. "He seemed in a good mood, actually," the driver recalled. "Said something about surprising his wife, gave me a big tip and everything. Never would have guessed what was about to happen." One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was the interrogation of Derek himself. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, he had been largely unresponsive, seemingly in a state of shock. As the days passed, however, he began to emerge from his stupor, the full weight of his actions settling upon him. Sergeant Harper, a veteran of countless difficult interviews, found himself unsettled by Derek's demeanor during questioning. There was no remorse, not really, he later confided to the district attorney. It was more confusion, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd done, but also couldn't bring himself to regret it. It was chilling. "We understand the community's desire for swift resolution," the mayor stated, his face grave. "But we must ensure that every aspect of this tragic case is examined thoroughly. We owe it to the victims, to their loved ones, and to our entire community to get this right." As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to wind down. The mountain of evidence collected, physical, testimonial, and circumstantial, all pointed to the same conclusion. Derek Johnson, upon discovering his wife's affair with his son, had committed a brutal double homicide in a fit of uncontrollable rage. With the case built and the evidence catalogued, it was time for the next phase to begin. The district attorney's office prepared to bring charges against Derek Johnson, setting the stage for what promised to be one of the most high-profile trials in Oakdale's history. As the indictment was announced, Sergeant Harper stood before a sea of reporters, his face etched with the weariness of a man who had looked too long into the abyss of human nature. "Today we are one step closer to justice for Vanessa and Xavier Johnson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "But make no mistake, there are no winners here. 3 lives were destroyed that day, and countless others have been forever altered. Our job now is to ensure that the full truth comes to light, and that those responsible are held accountable for their actions." With those words, the investigation phase of the Oakdale Hammer murders came to a close. But for the community, for the families of the victims, and for Derek Johnson himself, the ordeal was far from over. The trial loomed on the horizon, promising to lay bare the dark secrets and hidden tensions that had led to that fateful day, and to determine the fate of a man who had, in a moment of blind fury, destroyed everything he had ever cared about. As the date of the trial approached, the small town of Oakdale found itself thrust into the national spotlight once again. News vans lined the streets surrounding the courthouse, and reporters from across the country descended upon the quiet suburb, each hoping to uncover some new angle on the sensational case that had captivated the public imagination. Inside the imposing granite building of the Oakdale County Courthouse, preparations were underway for what promised to be one of the most high-profile trials in the state's recent history. The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Sarah Goldstein, worked tirelessly to build their case against Derek Johnson. Goldstein, a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for toughness and meticulous preparation, knew that despite the seemingly overwhelming evidence, this case would be far from straightforward. "We're dealing with a defendant who, up until the day of the murders, was a respected member of the community," she explained to her team during a strategy session. "We need to be prepared for the defense to paint this as a momentary lapse, a crime of passion. Our job is to show that regardless of the circumstances, the level of violence exhibited here was extreme and unforgivable." On the other side of the aisle, Derek's defense team was grappling with the unenviable task of mounting a defense for a client caught in the act of a brutal double homicide. Led by prominent criminal defense attorney Maxwell Roth, known for his unconventional strategies and ability to connect with juries, the team decided to pursue a temporary insanity defense. "Our client was not in his right mind when this tragedy occurred," Roth argued in pretrial motions. "The shock of discovering his wife's infidelity, coupled with the betrayal by his own son, created a perfect storm of emotional distress that temporarily robbed Mr. Johnson of his ability to distinguish right from wrong." As the legal teams prepared their strategies, the process of jury selection began. Given the extensive media coverage of the case, finding impartial jurors proved to be a significant challenge. Day after day, potential jurors were questioned about their knowledge of the case, their views on infidelity, and their ability to set aside any preconceived notions and judge solely on the evidence presented in court. Meanwhile, the families of the victims struggled to come to terms with the impending trial. Vanessa's parents, George and Helen Taylor, had flown in from their retirement home in Florida to attend the proceedings. The elderly couple, their faces etched with grief, made a poignant sight as they entered the courthouse each day, supported by a group of friends and relatives. "We just want justice for our baby girl," Helen told reporters in a brief statement, her voice quavering with emotion. "And for Xavier too. They didn't deserve what happened to them. No one does." Xavier's mother, Derek's ex-wife Lisa, maintained a more private presence. She declined all requests for interviews, but her pain was evident in the haunted look in her eyes as she slipped into the courthouse each morning, flanked by a pair of stoic bodyguards. As the days ticked down to the start of the trial, tension in Oakdale reached a fever pitch. The community found itself divided, with some expressing sympathy for Derek, a man they had known and respected for years, while others called for the harshest possible punishment for his actions. In his cell at the county jail, Derek Johnson sat alone, staring at the wall. The once powerful executive had aged years in the months since his arrest, his hair now streaked with gray, deep lines etched into his face. As he contemplated the start of his trial, and the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars, one question echoed endlessly in his mind. How had it all come to this? As dawn broke on the first day of the trial, a crowd had already begun to gather outside the courthouse. Some held signs calling for justice, others for mercy. News helicopters circled overhead, their rotors a constant reminder of the intense scrutiny under which the proceedings would take place. Inside the courthouse, final preparations were underway. Bailiffs checked and rechecked security measures, court reporters tested their equipment, and the attorneys for both sides reviewed their opening statements one last time. In a small room, just off the main courtroom, Judge Evelyn Cho, known for her no-nonsense approach and strict adherence to courtroom decorum, donned her robes. As she prepared to enter the courtroom and call the trial to order, she paused for a moment, the weight of the task before her settling heavily on her shoulders. The Oakdale Hammer murders trial was about to begin, and with it, the final chapter in a tragedy that had shaken a community to its core and forced a nation to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of love, betrayal, and the capacity for violence that lurks within even the most seemingly ordinary of individuals. As the bailiff's voice rang out with the traditional, "All rise," a hush fell over the packed courtroom. Judge Evelyn Cho entered, her face a mask of impassivity as she took her seat at the bench. With a sharp rap of her gavel, she called the court to order, and the trial of Derek Johnson officially began. District Attorney Sarah Goldstein rose to deliver her opening statement, her posture confident, her voice clear and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her eyes sweeping across the 12 men and women who would decide Derek's fate. "What we have before us is not a case of temporary insanity or a crime of passion. What we have is a premeditated act of brutal violence, committed by a man who chose rage and revenge over reason and humanity." Over the next hour, Goldstein laid out the prosecution's case in meticulous detail. She painted a picture of Derek Johnson as a controlling, obsessive individual whose perfect life was nothing more than a carefully constructed facade. She spoke of his demanding nature, his need for dominance in both his professional and personal life, and how the discovery of his wife's affair had shattered his illusion of control. "But make no mistake," Goldstein emphasized, her voice rising with passion, "discovering infidelity, no matter how painful, does not justify murder. Mr. Johnson had choices. He could have left the house. He could have called the police. Instead, he chose to pick up a hammer and brutally end 2 lives." As Goldstein spoke, crime scene photos were displayed on a large screen behind her. The images were graphic, showing the bloodied bodies of Vanessa and Xavier, the spattered walls, the murder weapon lying discarded on the floor. Several jurors visibly recoiled, and a muffled sob could be heard from the gallery where the victims' families sat. The prosecution's first witness was Sergeant James Harper, the lead investigator on the case. Harper provided a detailed timeline of events, from Derek's unexpected return home to his arrest at the scene. He described the state of the crime scene, his voice professional, but tinged with a hint of the horror he had witnessed. "In my 23 years on the force," Harper testified, "I've never seen such a violent, sustained attack. The victims suffered multiple blows, far more than would have been necessary to cause death. This wasn't just a moment of rage, it was a prolonged assault." As Harper's testimony continued, he detailed the evidence found at the scene. The blood-spattered hammer with Derek's fingerprints, the signs of struggle in the bedroom, the packed suitcase in the foyer that corroborated Derek's story of returning home unexpectedly. The prosecution then called a series of character witnesses, colleagues of Derek's who spoke of his demanding nature and perfectionist tendencies, friends of Vanessa's who recounted her growing unhappiness in the marriage, and Xavier's college roommate, who tearfully described the young man's conflicted relationship with his father. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist who had evaluated Derek in the months following his arrest. Dr. Rodriguez took the stand, her manner calm and professional as she addressed the court. "In my professional opinion," she stated, "Mr. Johnson does not meet the criteria for a diagnosis of temporary insanity. While he was undoubtedly in a state of extreme emotional distress, he was aware of his actions and their consequences. The level of violence exhibited, the duration of the attack, and Mr. Johnson's attempts to clean himself up afterwards all indicate a degree of rational thought process, even if that process was distorted by rage." As Dr. Rodriguez spoke, Derek sat at the defense table, his face a mask of stoic indifference. But those seated close to him later reported seeing his hands trembling, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The prosecution's case continued for several more days, with Goldstein methodically building a narrative of a controlling man whose world had spun out of control, leading to an explosion of violence. She emphasized the brutality of the crime, the betrayal not just of a spouse, but of a child, and the devastating impact on the families left behind. In her closing argument, Goldstein stood before the jury, her voice passionate but controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence, you've seen the photos, you've listened to the testimonies of those who knew Derek Johnson, Vanessa Johnson, and Xavier Johnson. What happened in that bedroom was not a momentary lapse of reason. It was not temporary insanity. It was a deliberate act of violence, born out of a need for control and a rage that had been simmering for years." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Derek Johnson made a choice that day. He chose to pick up that hammer. He chose to strike, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, long after his victims had ceased to be a threat. He chose to end 2 lives in the most brutal way imaginable. Now, it's your turn to make a choice. Choose justice. Choose to hold this man accountable for his actions. Choose to send a message that no amount of wealth, no social status, no claim of momentary passion can excuse such a heinous act." As Goldstein returned to her seat, a palpable tension filled the courtroom. All eyes turned to the defense table, where Maxwell Roth prepared to present his case. The question on everyone's mind was clear. How could anyone defend against such overwhelming evidence? What possible explanation could there be for such a brutal act? The stage was set for the defense to present their side of the story, to try and paint a different picture of Derek Johnson, not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man pushed beyond his limits by betrayal and heartbreak. As the court adjourned for the day, speculation ran wild about what strategies Roth might employ to save his client from a life behind bars. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements from both legal teams, while pundits on every news channel debated the strength of the prosecution's case. In homes across Oakdale and beyond, people followed the trial with rapt attention, each development fueling further discussion and debate about love, loyalty, and the limits of human endurance. As night fell on the 4th day of the trial, Derek Johnson sat alone in his cell, the weight of his actions and the uncertain future ahead pressing down upon him. Tomorrow, his attorney will begin to present his defense. Tomorrow, he would learn whether there was any hope of avoiding a life sentence, or if the hammer that had destroyed his family would also be the instrument of his own downfall. As the 5th day of the trial dawned, tension in the courtroom was palpable. Maxwell Roth, Derek Johnson's defense attorney, rose to deliver his opening statement, his demeanor calm and collected despite the challenging task ahead. Next, Roth called several of Derek's childhood friends and former colleagues, each of whom painted a picture of a kind, hard-working man who had overcome a difficult upbringing to achieve success. They spoke of his dedication to his family, his generosity to friends in need, and his involvement in community charities. "I don't remember much after that," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was like I was watching someone else, like I was outside my own body. I heard screaming. I think it was me. And then, And then it was over, and I was standing there, and they were. He broke off, unable to continue. In his closing argument, Roth appealed to the jury's sense of empathy and human fallibility. "We are not here to excuse what happened," he said, his voice grave. "Two lives were lost, and that is a tragedy beyond measure. But we are here to understand it, to see it for what it was. Not a cold-blooded, premeditated act of murder, but a moment of madness brought on by unimaginable pain and betrayal." He paced before the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn. "The prosecution would have you believe that Derek Johnson is a monster, that he deserves to spend the rest of his life behind bars. But I ask you to look at the whole picture. Look at the life he led before that terrible day. Look at the circumstances that drove him to this point. And then ask yourselves, in his shoes, faced with that same moment of shattering betrayal, can you say with certainty that you wouldn't have lost control?" As Roth concluded his impassioned plea, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The ball was now in the jury's court. They would have to weigh the prosecution's evidence of a brutal, excessive attack against the defense's portrayal of a man driven to temporary madness by extreme emotional trauma. As the judge instructed the jury and sent them to begin their deliberations, a sense of anticipation settled over the courtroom. The fate of Derek Johnson hung in the balance, as did the question of justice for Vanessa and Xavier. In homes and offices across Oakdale and beyond, people waited with bated breath for the verdict that would bring this tragic story to its conclusion. The deliberations stretched on for days, with the jurors meticulously reviewing the evidence presented, rewatching key testimonies, and engaging in heated debates about the nature of culpability and the limits of human endurance. As the deliberations entered their fourth day, media speculation reached a fever pitch. Legal experts on every news channel offered their predictions, while social media buzzed with armchair analysis and impassioned opinions from the public. Finally, on the morning of the fifth day, the jury foreperson sent word to the bailiff. They had reached a verdict. As news spread that a decision had been made, the courthouse once again became the center of attention. Reporters jostled for position outside, while inside, the courtroom quickly filled to capacity. Derek Johnson was led in, looking haggard and pale. His eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on a fixed point in the distance. At the prosecution table, Sarah Goldstein sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of professional composure. Across the aisle, Maxwell Roth placed a reassuring hand on Derek's shoulder, though his own expression betrayed his anxiety. Judge Cho called the court to order, her voice cutting through the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she responded, "We have, Your Honor." As the clerk read out the verdict, a collective intake of breath could be heard throughout the courtroom. "On the count of murder in the first degree for Vanessa Johnson, we find the defendant, Derek Johnson, guilty." A murmur rippled through the spectators, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. "On the count of murder in the first degree for Xavier Johnson, we find the defendant, Derek Johnson, guilty." The reaction was immediate. A wail of anguish rose from the section where Vanessa's parents sat, while on the other side of the aisle, Xavier's mother, Lisa, buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs.